Hi, my name is Clay Tumey, and I am an ambassador for the Enneagram Prison Project. Over the past year, we've used this podcast as an opportunity to tell the story of EPP as we approached our 10th anniversary, which we ultimately celebrated last month on April 12th, 2022. Today, I'm sad to announce that this will be the final episode of the podcast. And also, that's totally not true. I'm just kidding. I gotcha. Sorry, I think that's funny, and I hope you thought that was funny too. Maybe you won't. Anyways, hey, so what's happening? It's Clay. I want to talk to you today about a few things that are going to be happening with the podcast moving forward. I also want to share some of my favorite moments from this first season. And this, I guess you could consider this like a little bonus episode before we begin season 2 next month. And by the way, season 2 will officially begin next month in June. It will be on the first Tuesday of the month, which is June 7th. And I'll go into some details. We're not going to be doing the 12th of the month anymore. And I think we're going to try to do the first Tuesday of every month. There's a truck driving down my street right now. Hopefully you can't hear that. Anyways, this will be a very informal conversation. There's no guest. There's no anybody sitting across from me to have conversation with. Just you, just me, having a little chat. Now I know this was only going to be, or at least I said in the beginning that it was a 1-year commitment from me. And I didn't know what happened after the year was over. I didn't have any plans one way or the other. And I thought of it more of like, yeah, I'll do this anniversary, build up thing. And then I'll cross that bridge when I get there as far as what happens after that. And I can tell you that after a year of talking to 20 plus very interesting people that I absolutely love this. I've fallen in love with sitting down from people and hearing their stories. And I have a very unique role in the podcast in that I feel like I'm basically the number one listener. Like I have the pleasure of listening to everybody before you do, but ultimately at the end of the day, I still feel like I'm just a listener. And yeah, I get to talk to, and I play some role in editing and, processing and making sure that things sound just right. And, there's more to it than only listening for me, but primarily I feel like I just have a front row seat to some of the most amazing perspectives in the game as far as I'm concerned. So I love it and I want to keep doing it. So that's what's going to happen. So what's going to be on the episode today if there's no guest, Clay? Well, I'm glad you asked. How about we just go back through the first season and hear some of the key points of each episode? I don't know if you have any favorite moments. I know I certainly do. The things that people said that just hit me like a ton of bricks, or things that I just thought were funny. I have timestamps for a lot of these things, and I have clips that I've shared with friends. I also remember in the moment things that people have said that just floored me. For most of the first season of the podcast, I talked to my mom the day that the uploads went live. And so I had conversations with her about each episode as well. So I remember a lot of the things that she pointed out, the things that people said, and probably most notably the things that were said by Phil, one of our guides in Minnesota, and of course Russ, who was here in Dallas visiting, and I had the chance to talk to him. So everybody probably has their own perspective, or not probably, everybody definitely has their own perspective and the things that stuck out to them from the podcast. And I certainly have mine. And so if it's okay, I would just like to share a few quotes, and I'll just play these as clips, one right after the other with no context. I don't think most of them will require a lot of context anyways. So yeah, let's have a listen at a year in review of the Enneagram Prison Project podcast, season 1. I don't know. I was going to try to make that like a formal introduction to this, but let's just listen. We're going to start with Vic back in episode 1, and we'll just roll from there.
I don't know if it was from the reading. I think it was more or less from the interaction between Susan and the way that she viewed us and the way that she actually talked to me as a human being, that right there sparked the notation in my head that holy shit, that there's hope. You know what I mean? That somebody is actually here for me and not because they want to collect a paycheck. You know what I mean? They were sincere about what they were trying to teach. And then going back to the book and actually reading the book, and then it's showing me a little bit more about myself. But I mean, in the classroom is where it hit me the most. I'll never forget that and the feeling. You know, I even tell Susan over and over again, and I'll tell anybody this over and over again, even though she doesn't want to hear it. Like, that lady, she saved my life.
Yeah.
Like, I know I did the work, but she showed up. She saved my life. She gave me that opportunity to take that step into the unknown and figure life out.
I remember distinctly when the aha moment came to me and when I was like, okay, there's something to this thing. Susan Herrick, she came, she was one of the guests that came inside to teach us, and she's a 9. And at this point in time, I'm really trying to wrap my mind around how this thing works, because I'm trying to figure it out before I learn it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. It does. Right?
And so she asked me this question, man, and it almost brought me to tears. She asked me, what do I need? And I could not answer that question because I had not a clue what Alex needed, because Alex never paid attention to herself. And that's when I was like, wow.
Yeah.
You know, and it blew me away to the point where I said, I would never, ever not be able to answer that question again. And the only way that can happen is that I pay attention to me and I start to know me, that I start to be important to me. And that's when the teaching started making sense, the purpose, and just the whole ground level. And the readings even started making sense, and it was real. You know, we can't afford to forget where we came from. We can't afford to forget the history as we move forward into the future, because the possibilities of what would happen to someone else, it's a reality for us. It's not that might happen. This will happen.
Yeah.
That's how I approach it each and every day. I'll be like, you know what? If I do this, if I make this choice, this is what's going to happen, and which helps me make the right choice.
Yeah.
Because if I put a choice in there that it might, well, that leaves too big of a gap for me to do. And so I can't even afford that. So and the reality is, it may not happen to everybody else, but this is what's going to happen to me.
Like, I had no idea of how to go through life in a healthy manner. I didn't even know how to identify when I was healthy or unhealthy. So, like, for me, like, all these little basic, things in life that people take for granted because it's easy for them. Like, for me, waking up and making good decisions it takes effort. You know what I mean? Like, it's...
You said take effort, man. That takes some hard work, bro.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And maybe I'm understating a little bit by saying it takes effort, but it's not easy for me, at least. I can't speak for anybody.
It's not.
And I don't have that thing in my brain, and I say this all the time, dude. Like, I'm not a different person. I just make different choices. I don't always care about what's right or wrong. I just do things that I think will be fun or will be good or will be interesting or whatever. Like this conversation, there was no consideration about, is this a good idea or a bad idea? It's just like, I want to do it. I want to do it, and now I'm doing it, right?
Yeah.
So having the understanding of type and knowing what it means to be, in my case, a type 5, and how that can work very well sometimes and how it could work against me sometimes. It can make life easy. It can make life hard. Like, knowing more about that has just made life easier for me. Those are a couple of snippets from episode number 1, Chopping It Up with Vic Soto and Alex Senegal, 2 of my fellow ambassadors. In the second episode of the podcast, I sat down with Susan Olesic. And like I said, please correct me if this is not accurate, but it doesn't sound like it was, I want to serve the incarcerated, and this is how I'm going to do it. It was more like, I just want to serve people, and oh, by the way, they're inviting me to prison. Is that fair to say it that way?
That's true. I wasn't ever seeking out how to get myself into prison. I have always been a social justice seeker. I have always been somebody who feels convicted by things that affect the masses, and especially things that are unfair. So
what's going through your head when you're like, all right, I'm about to go in here and do this thing?
Honestly, don't remember feeling, I don't know if I can say any, but much at all, trepidation in the way of the prison part. I didn't feel scared by that. I felt excited. I didn't feel nervous, like, or apprehensive because of the fact that it was a facility. I didn't feel any of that. I didn't. I did feel really, really terrified that I wouldn't remember the Enneagram enough, that I didn't know all the stuff. I did feel a lot of self-doubt and all those sorts of things. But in terms of the prison part, I just felt very sure that was where I wanted to be, and like kind of impatient to get there. I think a lot of the hope that I feel when I'm on the inside is working with people who have been, raised in childhoods full of darkness and have really done maybe some very dark things. I think it's that touch, not a touchstone, I guess it's not, but like a reference point for how bad things have been is what gives people such equanimity on the outside. I've heard ambassadors say this in their own way, all of them. But like, I'm so grateful for how things are today because I know where I've been, and I have perspective on what really matters, and I can feel my own place in the world because I know where I'm not. And it's just, it strikes me. And I think that you are someone who's come through a lot of dark, and you are someone who's here to shed a lot of light. And I love your voice. I love how you're amplifying different pieces of this project for people who might not have heard all the little nooks and crannies and turned over a few stones today too. Thank you, Clay.
Thank you, Susan. So episode 3 was EPP Goes to Jail. And this is when we spoke with Neelam Wadhwani, who was the program manager at a correctional facility in California. And I'm leaving out the name because I actually don't remember if we said it on the episode itself. And sometimes we can't say those things. But if you haven't heard that episode, I would highly recommend going back to listen to it. It's an interesting exchange because not only is it nice to talk with Neelam because she's one of our earliest accomplices with EPP. She helped us get in to the facility there. She was the program manager. So without her help, I actually don't think it was possible to even get in there. And at that facility is where EPP met many of our current ambassadors. And one of those ambassadors, Victor Soto, was on the call for that episode as well. And there was an exchange at the end. It's the only clip I'm going to play from that episode where you hear Vic just express gratitude. And I'll only say that, and I won't give more context other than to say that these things don't happen. It's very rare that someone who is incarcerated gets out and turns around and is thankful for someone who worked at the jail or the prison where they were locked up. As someone who's been incarcerated myself, I can tell you, I don't have a lot of favorable opinions for those who work for the state, who work for the federal government, the people who work at the prisons and jails where I was incarcerated. I don't think they're all bad people. I just don't always have a lot of pleasant things to say about them because I don't genuinely or generally feel that they ever cared about me. And so I think that's part of what makes this exchange so beautiful. And that's why I would like to share that with you again today.
Well, the thing is like if she wouldn't have took that step into letting Susan in, my life wouldn't be the way it is now. So you don't have a small part to play in it. You really have one of the biggest parts to play in my life-changing events, whether you can see that or not. because you gave me the opportunity to meet Susan. You gave Susan the opportunity to meet me and to help me, further on my life and changing, my behavioral patterns and my thought process and learning how to trust. So if it wasn't for you, Neelam, like, honestly, the things you see about my life and the way that my life is going wouldn't have been possible, because if he didn't let her in, then I wouldn't have known her. So, I just want to thank you for giving, guys like me the opportunity to further our life and to see what our life can be. I never had a chance to tell you that, and I'm glad I could tell you now.
Yeah, me too. The world is better with people like Neelam Wadhwani. And, there are people who work in corrections who are on our side, who are EPP accomplices. And even those who we don't know, who aren't affiliated with us directly, they're still doing good things. And it's actually, just full disclosure, it's hard for me to remember that sometimes, because I know what it's like to be locked up and to just be surrounded by people who just don't give a shit. So thank God for Neelam. Thank God for people like Neelam. And and they're growing in numbers, by the way. And it's been a pleasure to meet a lot of folks along the way who are, as I say, on our side. They're an accomplice, EPP accomplices. Episode 4 was the reentry episode. This is where I sat down with a number of ambassadors to talk about reentry, and specifically what it's like that first day out of prison and some of the hurdles that you might face, or how easy it could be if you just say, I'm not going back and I'm going to pay attention to what's in front of me instead of what's behind me. And there were, I think, 5 different conversations, 5 different perspectives with ambassadors. And I'm not going to play a clip here. I don't have any particular clips that I want to pull and drop here. I will say that that was the first 2-hour episode that we did, episode 4, reentry, and it's worth a listen. If you haven't heard those ambassadors' stories about their first days, weeks, months out of prison, then go give it a listen. It's pretty cool. Episode 5 was a conversation with Russ Hudson, and it was not intentional for episode 5 to be with a type 5 talking to another type 5. It just worked out that way. Russ happened to be coming through town he was speaking with it was non-EPP stuff, and I actually don't remember the details. I just know he was here for another event, and I messaged. Thankfully, Rick Olesic knew that Russ was going to be in Dallas, and so I messaged Russ and I was like, "Hey, man, if you got a minute, would you be down to sit down in front of a couple microphones and have a chat for the podcast?" And of course, Russ was like, "Yeah, sure, sounds good." And he's my buddy. We talked about some Enneagram stuff. We also talked about some things that I think most people have never heard Russ talk about, simply because there's not always a reason for him to talk about locking people in a closet and try. Well, I'll just let him tell this story.
Oh dear.
Or you can narrow it down to 3 stories if you want.
Oh my! I don't know. I would just
the statute of limitations.
When I got a little older, I can remember them more. When I was a young kid, I did some crazy ones.
Yeah.
These guys were trying to steal something from me, and I locked them in a closet, and I taped up around the edges and hooked up a vacuum cleaner. I was trying to suck the air out of the closet. That's a little mad behavioral problem, mad scientist style, right?
Yeah. They didn't die.
And they didn't die, fortunately. Yeah. But, I would, when I was in the frenzy of doing that, I wouldn't have minded.
Yeah.
I was really mad. But, I just had those kind of mad scientist kind of ideas. And, sometimes it was simple, When I was in junior high, I remember certain guys picking on me, and I had 2 things going for me. One was that some of the really tough kids that were, headed for a life of challenge, shall we say, they always, we were both the weirdos. We're the outliers. We were the misfits. So they kind of looked after me. Yeah. So when just the kind of regular school bullies who were just never interesting people, the real badass kids would take care of me and sometimes take care of them, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, exactly.
So I had like a little posse, which was good.
It was good. And also good was the rest of that conversation, because he also went on to talk about he had someone that was taking his lunch or eating his sandwich or something like that. So he replaced his food with some things that he grew in a lab, shall we say. And a lot of those stories you just don't really get to hear from someone like Russ in that setting, because frankly, most of the time you're there asking questions about the Enneagram or about things that are related to the Enneagram or Egypt or other things like that. And one of the things that I find so liberating and enjoyable about the podcast is that I don't really have anyone that's telling me, stick to the Enneagram, talk about this, talk about that. It's actually really nice to just sit down and say, hey, so yeah, sure, you're Russ Hudson, type 5, master of the Enneagram, guru, all these things. But what else do people like not know? And so episode 5, we discovered a lot of things about Russ that we might not have previously known. And then also, the episode was over an hour long. So naturally, the Enneagram and other teachings do weave their way back into the conversation. So if you haven't heard that episode, I would just say it's worth the listen. I'll just understate it by saying that. Episodes 6 and 7 are when we started talking to guides. We spoke with Camilla and Dana and Phil and Suzanne across those 4 episodes. And I think for me, this is when I started realizing the impact that the podcast could have. And of course, with Russ and some of the things that he shared about having self-compassion and some of the things that he said that would creep their way into the conversations that I would have with my mom after the podcast came out. A lot of those experiences continued with episodes 6 and 7, and particularly with Phil in episode 7, where he spoke about his life as not only an Enneagram guide, an Enneagram teacher, but also as a pastor in his church.
Yeah, well, I was introduced to it by a Lutheran pastor, so that kind of helps. One. I could sense the good-heartedness, the spiritual groundedness that I still feel to this day, that the Enneagram comes out of. So, we could talk more about this because I find it fascinating, but that my Christian theology and EPP theology, cosmology approach match really, really. I don't have to set aside my Christian faith. I do kind of set it aside. I don't even the first couple times in prison, every once in a while, I would try to make a little connection, partly because so many of the women in the class.
Connection to what?
Thank you for asking. Connection between, I would say something like, and this is the same kind of thing it says in the New Testament.
Gotcha.
When Paul says, partly because so many women in the class in Shakopee were clearly and really very faithful, Christian faithful kind of people. But every time it didn't feel good to me, even if I thought that was a really good connection, it didn't actually work in the class. And so now I don't talk about that at all when I'm teaching an EPP, but inside of myself, like a highway, 2 lanes going the same direction.
Yeah. And I will forever be grateful for Phil's description there and his explanation about how faith and spiritual work can coincide. And they are often going the same direction right next to each other, and there's no conflict, and they don't get in the way of each other, and they don't overlap and, try to direct the other one in a different way or anything like that. They're literally just supplements for each other, which is a big deal. It's a big deal for a lot of people. And I really appreciate Phil walking us through that. And I don't know that I've ever even told him how big of a deal that conversation was for me, in particular because of my mom. And, I talk about my mom often. And so this is not likely the first time you've heard me say that, her journey with EPP in the last year has been pretty neat, been pretty cool, gone through some of our public programming. And, that began with the podcast, I think, in a lot of ways, and hearing Russ talk through some things, and also hearing Phil and so many of the other guides and ambassadors talk through some thoughts, through some ideas. And it's just been kind of cool to sit and watch that happen. So, yeah, I think at this point is when I realized that the podcast can serve a purpose beyond just talking with the listener. I think it actually can be a catalyst for someone to begin their own journey. And I know in at least one case, that's been exactly what has happened. So I'm going to pause here. And yes, I know that I've only made it halfway through the first season there, but that is intentional. Hopefully it's just enough of a tease for you to say to yourself, gee, maybe I should go back and just listen to all those episodes all over again. And I know I will probably very soon, because I'm going to be spending a lot of time in the sky and riding airplanes to different places. And if you hear anything in any of those episodes 1 through 14 from season 1, if you hear anything that is worth revisiting or discussing, or if you just want to say, hey, I thought this about that, feel free to tell somebody, tell me, tell anyone. Most of the people that you hear on the podcast can be reached via email, just their name at EnneagramPrisonProject.org. That's not always the case, but it's usually the case. Definitely the case with me, Clay at EnneagramPrisonProject.org. And if you're in the Slack community with the various channels of communication there, I'm also available there, as are most other people. There's also a Slack channel specifically for the podcast. And you're more than welcome to share any thoughts or ideas there as well. And I think eventually I would like to see the Slack channel there turn into a sort of ongoing discussion or town hall, just chat, or however you want to call that, to see what people like and what they want to hear more about, or even just see what they think about some of the ideas that we've shared on the podcast. So I wanted to keep this episode under 30 minutes. I don't think I'm going to make it there, because we're already rolling up on 29 minutes and I've got a few more things to say. So season 2, what's it going to be about? I'm glad you asked. So we won't be looking forward to a 10th anniversary, since we've already passed it. And I think the idea is just to move forward talking about who we are today and what we're doing now, and potentially what we might be doing in the near future or even the distant future. I'm going to keep talking to guides. I'm going to try to have more conversations with ambassadors. And I think we're getting a better idea, or at least I am, when I record these, how to do them in a way that's efficient and hopefully somewhat structured, with the idea that it's still structure free, as silly as that might sound. And, whatever happens in the coming season, I guess I'll experience it when you do. But the idea will be to keep talking to the people who make the project happen, the guides, the ambassadors, the faculty, the board members, the participants, the students, the people on the inside, the people on the outside, the builders, everyone. There's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. And thankfully, I'm in a position where I get to sit down across from those people and ask them, hey, what's going on right now? What do you do? And what are you here for? And what's important to you? And so those conversations are going to keep happening. And hopefully, as the second season rolls on, we will learn some new things about EPP and what the future looks like. So again, on the first Tuesday of next month, which is June the 7th, that will be when you can expect the next episode of the new season. And I'm looking forward to it. I already know the next few weeks have a lot of opportunity, and I'm just bubbling with joy to be able to share some of the things with you that have happened in the past few weeks, which now where we sit here, it's the next few weeks. But by the time we talk again, it'll be the past few weeks. So that's how time works, I guess. So for now, I will just say farewell and thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us someone to talk to, because as I said earlier, without you, the listener, this kind of doesn't really happen.